What's up everybody, it's Blue here from Blue Bears Games, and for today's video I will be showing you my newest budget commander build that will be available for sale on the Blue Bears Games Facebook page that uses what I'm going to shorthand to Asmoran as the commander. If you think I'm going to even attempt to say that whole name, you're crazy. Asmoran is the best you're going to get from me. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to ask for your help in supporting my channel, which can be done in the following ways. Subscribing to the channel, sharing any of my content on your socials, watching some of my many other videos, purchasing super thanks, purchasing channel memberships, purchasing decks that you may have seen on this channel directly from me on the Blue Bears Games Facebook page, and/or visiting our sponsor at arcane-fortress.com and using discount code BlueBear at checkout if you decide to purchase any of their amazing gaming supplies from them. Anything that you do will help support my channel immensely, and I thank you for it. Now that that is out of the way, let's get to today's video. This will be one of my more unique decks to date, to say the least. From the 3 different abilities that it will center around, to the commander itself, almost everything about this deck will be way more different than anything I've ever done for the budget decks that I make and sell. So let's take a look at Asmoran real quick so you can see what I'm talking about. Asmoran has no casting cost, but instead uses an ability that is built into it that says as long as you've discarded a card this turn, you may pay a hybrid of either a black or a red mana to cast this spell. Then it has 2 other abilities, the first of which says, when Asmoran enters, you may search your library for a card named the Underworld Cookbook, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. The last ability says that you can sacrifice 2 foods, and when you do, target creature deals 6 damage to itself. This ability can be done as many times as you have 2 foods to sacrifice to it. Looking at all that, you can see that this deck will need self-discard of some sort, and an ability to put foods into play, either by creating tokens or casting spells with the food subtype. I figured the best thing to do was to use the cycling ability as a way to discard cards, but do so in a way that also provides benefits for doing so. Additionally, I figured if I'm going to be discarding cards that don't have cycling, I may as well discard cards that have madness so they aren't just a wasted card. Makes sense, right? So, that means this deck will be an amalgamation of self-discard, cycling, food token making, and madness. Sounds like a lot to jam into one deck, but trust me, it all works well together. How did I do it, you ask? Well, let me show you. As I like to do, I will start with the lands. It's budget dual lands and then some utility stuff with some basics. So the budget dual lands are things like Akum Refuge, Bloodfell Caves, Rakdos Guild Gate, Thriving Bluff, and of course the other one which is Thriving Moor. And then we're going to get into some utility. So the utility lands that I have in here are all going to be cycling lands. So things like Forgotten Cave, Smoldering Crater, Barren Moor, and Polluted Mire. They all cycle away, and then of course the last one that cycles away is Ash Barrens. But this one cycles a little differently. It's basic land cycling, so you pay the 1, you discard it, and then you go search your library for a basic land card and put it in your hand rather than draw a card. Encroaching Waste, because I say it every single budget deck build video, I like to throw something in the decks that has the ability to get rid of a land because you never know what you're going to come across, and it's important. And then, of course, Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse for mana fixing and a little bit of deck thinning. And then the rest is going to be basic mountains and swamps. And I don't remember the exact number. I think it's 11 of each, but I will have the deck list linked in the description of this video so you can see for yourself. As far as the ramp for this deck goes, I'm not a big fan of one-shot stuff like Dark Ritual, which is what red and black both do. I'm okay with Mana Rocks, even if they're a little subpar. And there's one in here that's going to actually help fit the theme a little bit better. So I'll show you what I came up with. Traveler's Amulet, so you can do a little bit of deck thinning and mana fixing. Same thing with Renegade Map. Ominous Parcel, same thing as the last 2, only this one's a little bit better than those 2, because you have an option, if you want to use it as creature damage. So you can choose to either go get a land or maybe do removal with it. Mindstone, because if you don't need the mana anymore, at least you can sacrifice it and draw a card. And then Charcoal Diamond and Fire Diamond, because they are 2 to cast, and while they come into play tapped, they're still a little bit better than some of the 3 to cast rocks out there. The last one is the one that's the most interesting. I went with Magnifying Glass. It investigates, which helps you draw a card, basically puts a card draw trigger in the bank for you. However, this deck does have a small sub-theme here that deals with artifacts, because you can sacrifice them for other things, and I'll show you all that later, but the fact that you can put a Clue token, which is an artifact in play that you can use for either to draw a card or to use for something else. That's why I have this in here. It was a good inclusion. While it's 3 to cast, it facilitates a lot of other things. Moving on to the largest section of this deck, which is the creature section, I've got 4 sections of creatures. We're going to have cyclers, we're going to have madness creatures, we're going to have stuff that facilitates food tokens, because Asmoran does actually work with food tokens, and then we're going to have payoffs, and some of those payoffs will be the parts where you get your damage in without having to go through combat damage. So the cyclers, I'll start with Reinforced Ronin, which is kind of odd because, no, it doesn't cycle, but it channels, which is basically this card's version of cycling with a different name. So it's one that casts 2/2 with haste that says at the beginning of your end step, you return it back to its owner's hand, and then it channels for 1 red and 1 generic, and you discard it to draw a card, which is basically cycling with a different name. And then we have Draneth Stinger, which is one of the things that I have in here that will facilitate winning without having to do combat damage. So it's a 2 to cast 2/2. It says whenever you cycle another card, it deals 1 damage to each opponent, and it itself cycles for 1. So this is where some of your damage will be coming from that's not combat damage. And then we're going to have a bunch of other cyclers that are a little subpar because they have cycling, but because in conjunction with all the other stuff, they actually make sense. So Quakefoot Cyclops, a 5 to cast 4/4 that cycles for 2, and it says that when it enters the battlefield, up to 2 target creatures can't block this turn. Nothing spectacular, but it cycles, and that's the whole point of it. Rooting Moloch, it's a 5 to cast 4/4 that when it enters the battlefield, exile target card with cycling ability from your graveyard, and until at the end of your next turn, you may play that card, and it cycles for 2. Chartooth Cougar is a 6 to cast 4/4 that has a fire-breathing ability, and it has mountain cycling. So when you cycle this away, you go and search your library for a mountain rather than drawing a card. Desert Ceradon, 6 to cast 6/4, cycles for 1 red. Lava Serpent, a 6 to cast 5/5 with haste and cycles for 2. Granitic Titan, a 6 to cast 5/4 with menace and cycles for 2. Sanctuary Smasher, a 6 to cast 6/4 with first strike, cycles away for 3, and then when you cycle it, you may put a first strike counter on target creature that you control. That could be handy. Wasteland Scorpion, a 3 to cast 2/2 with Death Touch and cycles for 2. Lurching Rotbeast, a 4 to cast 4/2 that cycles for a black. Horror of the Broken Lands is a 5 to cast 4/4 that can cycle for a black, but it says whenever you cycle or discard another card, which is key here because this deck also discards cards without having to cycle them, it gets +2/+1 until end of turn. So if this guy is out in play, and you're doing the thing that this deck is trying to do, which is cycle away all of its cards for something to do later, he can actually be a one-shot if he gets through. Street Wraith, 5 to cast 3/4, that has Swamp Walk and cycles away by paying 2 life. Twisted Abomination is a 6 to cast 5/3 with Swamp cycling, and it regenerates for a black. And then Void Beckoner is the last cycling creature here. It's an 8 to cast 8/8 with Death Touch, cycles for 3, and then when you cycle it away, you can put a Death Touch counter on a creature you control. So those are the cyclers. It's a lot of high cast stuff, but the point of them is to cycle them away and then get them back later through other means. Now we're going to go over the madness creatures. This is because we have the ability to discard cards on our own with other things, and I'll show you them in a little bit. So you can actually discard these cards and then pay the madness cost and still get what they are. So they become the creatures. So this is Reckless Worm. It is a 5 to cast 4/4 with trample and a madness cost of 3. Big Game Hunter is a 3 to cast 1/1 that says when it enters the battlefield, you destroy target creature with power 4 or greater, and it can't be regenerated, and its madness cost is 1 black. And then Grave Scrabbler is a 4 to cast 2/2 with a madness cost of 1 black and 1 generic. And then when it enters the battlefield, if its madness cost was paid, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to its owner's hand. The last madness creature is Kitchen Imp. It is a 4 to cast 2/2 with flying and haste and a madness cost of 1 black. So those are the madness creatures. Now we're going to go over the food stuff because, as I said, Asmoran does play well with food tokens, so we had to have ways to create food tokens. So up first is Experimental Confectioner. It's a 30 cast 2/3 that says when it enters the battlefield, you create a food token, and then whenever you sacrifice a food, you create a 1/1 black rat creature token with this creature can't block. The additional creatures that you can sacrifice for other things is helpful. They can also be attackers that will help you be able to go wide if you need to. Old Flitterfang is a 5 to cast 3/4 that has flying. At the beginning of each end step, if a creature died this turn, you create a food token, and then it has a sack outlet on it. It is a ability that is 3 and sacrificing a creature or an artifact, because remember those food tokens and those clue tokens are artifacts, and Old Flitterfang will get +2/+2 until end of turn. And then we have Scream Puff. This is a 5 to cast 4/5 with Death Touch that says whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you create a food token. So it's a repeatable way to get food tokens on the battlefield. And I tried to get as many ways to do that as possible. So the last part of the creatures is the payoffs. This is going to help facilitate the things like the cycling or the food tokens or what have you. So we start off with things like Prickly Marmoset. It is a 3 to cast 2/3 with First Strike that says whenever you cycle a card, it will get +2/+0. So another version of the black creature I showed you earlier, only it doesn't have cycling itself. So when you do cycle a bunch of cards, which you will be able to do, it will get a buff of +2/+0, and if you've attacked into somebody and they've let this go, you can start cycling mass amounts of cards away and possibly get a win with that. One of the other payoffs here for the cycling or discarding, because it's both, is Glinthorn Buccaneer, which is a 3 to cast 2/4 with haste that says whenever you discard a card, and when you cycle a card that is considered discarding, Glinthorn Buccaneer will deal 1 damage to each opponent. So this is another way to win without having to deal combat damage. And that has a built-in way to do what's called looting, which is you pay 2 and discard a card to draw a card. But you can only activate it if Glinthorn Buccaneer is attacking. It's the only caveat to this last ability. And then another payoff will be with all the food tokens and clue tokens that are coming into play that are artifacts. We have things like Reckless Fireweaver, which is a 2 to cast 1/3 that says whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, Reckless Fireweaver will deal 1 damage to each opponent. And similar to that is Ingenious Artillerist, which is a 3 to cast 3/1 that does the same thing. It says whenever 1 or more artifacts enter the battlefield under your control, the Artillerist will deal that much damage to each opponent. So if you have 3 artifacts enter play, it will deal 3 damage. Oval Chase Daredevil is a 4 to cast 4/2 that says whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you may return Oval Chase Daredevil from your graveyard to your hand. This helps with a couple of things. You can cast it and have a 4/2 that you can attack with recklessly, or you can use it as a discard outlet for being able to cast Asmoran, and then be able to get it back by having a food token or a clue token come into play. Then we have Zoyowa Lava Tongue. This is a 2 to cast 2/2 with Death Touch that says at the beginning of your end step, if you descended this turn, each opponent may discard a card or sacrifice a creature. Zoyowa deals 3 damage to each opponent who doesn't. So it's another little way to chip damage off of players without having to attack. Descending means that you had a permanent card go from anywhere into your graveyard. So if you discarded a creature card or any other permanent, this triggers, and then at the end of the turn, they will have to choose. Your opponents will have to choose whether or not to take 3 damage or sacrifice a permanent or discard a card. And the last creature is an enabler, if you will. It's Chainer Nightmare Adept. It's a 4 to cast 3/2 with an ability that says you can choose and discard a card, and if you do, you may cast a creature card from your graveyard this turn, but only once each turn. It's an enabler for being able to cast Asmoran or other things if you want to discard a card because you want Glinthorn Buccaneer to deal damage to each opponent. But the second part of it is that you can cast a creature that you've discarded or has died with this ability. Then it says whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if you didn't cast it from your hand, it gains haste until end of turn. So that's a nice little extra added bonus. And next up, I will show you the instant/sorceries of this deck. There are basically 2 types of spells that we're going to have here. We're going to have things that help you draw cards, and we're going to have things that are removal. And both of them are going to be unique to this style of play. They're all going to be looting cards, so things like Faithless Looting, which is the 1 to cast sorcery that lets you draw 2 cards and then discard 2 cards, and then you flash it back for 3 for an extra turn later. Or things like Tormenting Voice, which is a 2 to cast sorcery that, as an additional cost to cast a spell, you have to discard a card, and then you draw 2 cards. So there's going to be a couple of things like that. So like Thrill of Possibility is an instant version of that. Faithless Salvaging is a 2 to cast instant version of that, but you only get to draw 1 card instead of 2, and it has Rebound, so it can be cast again later. Cathartic Pyre, this one gives you modal choices, so you can choose to either have it deal 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker, or discard up to 2 cards to draw that many cards. Highway Robbery, so you can plot this one, but it does essentially the same thing as most of the other cards. Then you have Zazakap's Brew, which is basically the same as the last couple of cards, only now you can gift something, and if you do, you can now have all of your creatures that you control get +2/+0 until end of turn. Wild Guess is just a 2 red version of those cards. And the last one doesn't have that discard a card to draw cards. Instead, it has the ability to give you a food token. So it's Foreboding Fruit. It's 3 to cast sorcery that target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. And then if you paid 3 black mana into it, you create a food token. So those are the card draw cards. And then the removal, it's going to look a little weird because it's going to have some things with madness. We're going to have some things with cycling. They're not going to be the greatest, but they're going to be usable. Things like Murderous Compulsion, it's 2 to cast, and you can destroy target tapped creature and has a madness cost of 2. And here's the cool thing about madness. Madness doesn't restrict your rules for when you can play the card. If you discard a card, anytime you can pay its madness cost and cast the spell. So you can actually do this on your opponent's turn if you have a way to discard it to pay the madness cost. Saber, 2 to cast. This one doesn't have anything to do with madness or cycling. Instead, it has something to do with food tokens. So target creature gets -2/-2 in the turn, and then you create a food token. Easy Prey, 2 to cast instant. Destroy target creature with a mana value of 2 or less, or you can cycle it away for 2. Expunge, 3 to cast instant. You can destroy target non-artifact, non-black creature. That creature can't be regenerated, or you can cycle it away for 2. Ichor Slick is a little different. It's kind of cool. It's a 3 to cast sorcery that says target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. You can cycle it away for 2, but it also has madness built into it for 4, which means that you can pay 2 to cycle it and then 4 to actually do the madness, so you can draw an extra card and get the effects at the same time. Feed the Cauldron, it's another food one. It says destroy target creature with a mana value of 3 or less, and then if it's your turn when you cast it, you create a food token. Suffocating Fumes, this is a token killer. It's a 3 to cast instant that says creatures your opponents control get -1/-1 until end of turn, or you can cycle it for 2. SWAT destroys target creature with a power 2 or less, and you can cycle it for 2. Death Pulse is 4 to cast that says target creature gets -4/-4 until end of turn, or you can cycle it for 3, and when you cycle it, you may have target creature get -1/-1 until end of turn. And then the last one is actually probably the best removal of the bunch. It's a 4 to cast sorcery called Terminal Agony that just says simply destroy target creature with a madness cost of a black and a red. As for the enchantments that I chose for this deck, there are not many, but what I did put in here are really, really good for this deck. First one is Tectonic Reformation. It's a 2 to cast enchantment that says each land card in your hand can now cycle for 1 red, and it itself has cycling for 2. This will make it so that if you are trying to do a win with something like Glinthorn Buccaneer or the cycling damage guy, you can now use the lands to do it. Unfortunately, it only can be cycled for red and not 2, so one of the cards I'm about to show you in the artifacts does not help this, but if it's mid to late game, you might have enough red mana to do it. The last enchantment is called Feast of Sanity. It is a 4 to cast enchantment that says whenever you discard a card, it will deal 1 damage to any target, and you will gain a life. So it's another way to help you win the game. It's not the greatest because it doesn't deal damage to each opponent, and it's a little slower because of it, but it's additional damage on top that may actually get you there. And the last section that I'll show you is the artifacts section. They are all utility artifacts, and we start with the Underworld Cookbook because Asmoran lets you search for it. It is a 1 to cast artifact that you can tap it and discard a card to create a food token. Then you can pay 4 and tap it and sack it to return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. The first ability is kind of what this whole deck is based around, so obviously it's really good. The second ability, not so much, but I did include a card in here that I'll show you in just a second that helps make it a lot easier to do that ability and not worry about it, because you do want the Underworld Cookbook out in play. Next is Witch's Oven. It is a 1 to cast artifact that you can tap it and sacrifice a creature to create a food token. However, if the sacrificed creature's toughness was 4 or greater, you create 2 food tokens instead. If you go back and look at the rest of the deck, and you look at the creatures that I included that have cycling, a lot of them have a toughness 4 or greater, so you should get a bunch of food tokens out of them. The heart and soul of this deck, though, is Fluctuator. It is a 2 to cast artifact that makes cycling abilities that you activate cost up to 2 generic mana less to activate. Again, if you go back and look at the creatures I included, most of them have a cycling cost of either 2 or 1, so this will make them free. And this isn't a once a turn thing, this is all cycling abilities are 2 generic mana less to activate. Mirror Shield is my version of a Swiftfoot Boots or a Lightning Greaves. It helps protect a creature on the battlefield by giving it hexproof, and it's a budget version of it. Grimoire of the Dead is a 4 to cast legendary artifact that has 2 abilities. The first one, you pay 1, tap it, and discard a card to put a study counter on it. And the second one is really good for this deck because you're cycling a lot of creatures into your graveyard. It says you tap it and remove 3 study counters from it and sacrifice it to put all creature cards from all graveyards onto the battlefield under your control, and now they are black zombies in addition to their other colors and types. This is the artifact version of like Living Death or Living End, which I would have put in here if I had any, but I didn't, so that's an upgrade option. And this will be targeted for removal a lot, so that's why I put in the next card, Trading Post, for this and the Underworld Cookbook so you can get them back. So there are 4 abilities on Trading Post. It is 4 to cast, and the first ability says you can pay 1 and discard a card to gain 4 life, so that helps facilitate being able to cast Asmoran or other things that do damage when you discard a card. The second ability says you pay 1, tap, and pay a life to create an 0/1 white goat creature token, which could be useful, good for blocking. The third ability says you pay 1, tap it, and sacrifice a creature to return target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand, which is the most important part of this thing. So those creature tokens are sacrificial lambs, literally, especially if you're using the goats, to get artifacts back that you need. And then the last ability is pay 1, tap, and sacrifice an artifact to draw a card, which is always useful in any deck. And the last card in the entire deck is Oni Cult Anvil. It is a 2 to cast artifact that says whenever 1 or more artifacts you control leave the battlefield during your turn, you create a 1/1 colorless construct artifact creature token. However, this ability can only trigger once a turn. So it creates 1/1s for you that could be a go-wide combat strategy for you, or they are artifacts, which is very helpful for other things, like when artifacts enter the battlefield, they deal damage to each opponent, so that helps with another way to win. Or you can use them for the last ability, which says to tap it and sacrifice an artifact, and it will deal 1 damage to each opponent, and you will gain a life. So it's another way to whittle down your opponent's health totals. And that, my fellow Spellslingers, was Asmoran, my latest budget commander deck that will be available for sale on the Blue Bears Games Facebook page. If you're interested in purchasing this or any of my budget decks, just send me a message through the Facebook page, as it's currently the only way that I am making them available at the moment. As for this deck, I told you that it would all make sense once you saw the deck in its entirety. It's a unique one to say the least, but it does have some neat things going on. The combination of self-discard with madness, combined with cycling and ways to deal damage through discard, are both strategies that I've wanted to put together for a while now in Commander, so I was excited that I finally got to do it. While this may not end up being the most powerful deck in your arsenal, it will be one of the more fun ones to play, in my opinion. So what do you think? Does it look like it could be a fun build to try? Let me know in the comments. Well, folks, sadly, that's all I've got for you this week. Thanks for watching, and if you're looking for more Magic content to watch, please go browse my playlist, as I'm sure you'll find more videos of mine that you'll enjoy. Before you go, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet, so you can be notified when I release new content, which I do every Friday. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you all next week.